What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to the vlog. So this is the vlog for Friday, the 19th of November, 2021, and I've got a handful of things to run through today, pretty quick. I don't think this is going to be too terribly long. If you see me looking down a lot, I have notes on the table in front of me. So first of all, next week is Thanksgiving here in the US, and so as a result of that, as much as I've enjoyed, or as much as I wanted to keep doing a 3 videos a week schedule, I've decided that for Thanksgiving week, I'm only going to put up 1 video. So there's only going to be 1 video going up live next week, Monday. Part of that is just because of the holiday, and part of that is because some of the stuff that I've been working on has actually been taking me longer to shoot than I expected it to. For example, the EOS R5 histogram, some other stuff that's sort of spiraled out of that. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's more complex than I thought in the first place. And so I'm having a little bit of a hard time figuring out exactly how to test and evaluate things. So it's just taking longer than expected. And I'm running out of buffer, and so instead of blowing through all of the buffer that I have, I'm going to just space things out for a week, take a little bit of an opportunity to focus on getting back ahead of myself instead of having to constantly play catch up as I am getting to at this point. So that's the first thing. Only 1 video next week. Only 1 video next week, not 3. I won't be doing a vlog next week unless something really epic happens, so there is that. Second on my list is that Canon Europe, at least, has announced that there's a 1.5 version of the firmware coming for the EOS R5 and R6, as well as a firmware, I don't remember what the version number was, for the 1DX Mark III, that is going to add some features to the autofocus system and the camera. So, and some usability features that are maybe a bit more focused for professionals that use the wireless transfer capabilities or the image offloading capabilities. So, looking through the lists that I have published here, which I think was published on Canon Rumors, but there's also some stuff from Canon Europe and various places. I haven't seen anything official from Canon USA yet, but then they aren't quite as on the ball maybe about publishing up, notices of firmware updates. Like they don't release or publish that for some reason. So anyway, what the list is showing that I'm seeing is that they're making some changes to recording settings and for saving to remote drives, and this is going to be on the R5, R6, and 1DX Mark III. They're disabling they're giving you an option to disable the multi-controller push to send to stop accidentally sending files on the R5, R6, and 1DX. I've never actually used the FTP upload capabilities, so I guess there's that. They're changing the default FTP mode from active to passive on, again, all 3 cameras. I don't know why passive wasn't the default. FTP is a crappy old protocol, and it breaks horribly in all kinds of situations, especially when you have NAT and you have, like, address translation and stuff going on. It would be really nice if we could just stop using FTP and start using something that's more modern and less insecure and less of a massive hazard for the people running the server. So those are kind of the file transfer stuff that's happening. The big news is, it's big news. I don't know how big of a news it is, but vehicle and body detection AF is coming to the R5 and R6. So this is basically, as far as I can tell, all of the capabilities that the EOS R3 has in its AF system is coming to the R5 and R6. So that's a good thing. And this this is what I've kind of made this argument a couple times now. The camera autofocus systems, because so much of it is software related at this point, really should just be like a supplemental update that gets pushed out every time new capabilities are added. Okay, maybe, in 10 years and you have an R5 Mark III or something like that, that your R5 just isn't going to be able to do the same things that the R5 Mark III can do, 10 years down the road. But right now, for example, the R5, R6, and R3 all use the same Digic X processor. They should all have essentially the same processing capabilities for doing their autofocus stuff. So on anything that's added, so vehicle detection, better wildlife, new wildlife, snakes, lizards, whatever, should just be something that gets pushed out to everybody. Now, obviously, I can understand, like, the R3 launches with it and we get it in a firmware update. Like, that to me is completely reasonable. I wouldn't expect necessarily day one, parallel whatever. But then going forward, like, if in 6 months Canon adds elephant detection AF, then it should go out to all the cameras that support it simultaneously. At least that's my opinion on this. So vehicle and body detection is coming. Additionally, if they've improved the face detection AF for people wearing, or eye and face detection AF for people that are wearing masks, which is a thing now. So, it's something you're going to need if you're, or the camera's going to need to be able to deal with not being able to detect the entire face. It's going to have to, just deal with that. So that's a good thing to have. They're adding a white capture mode in live view, which basically will allow you to manually adjust the white balance in live view without having to go through hoops and menus and stuff. I don't really exactly know what that entails. I haven't, obviously I haven't seen it because it hasn't been, the firmware hasn't been made available yet. So it's entirely possibly, like, it, could be useful, could be useless, hard to tell. It's, what it is. So that's coming to the R5 and R6. They're adding an EVF smooth mode. So right now we have performance and power saving. This is apparently going to be another option that is going to suppress low frame rates in low light. So it'll be interesting to see how this affects power consumption. The EVF on the camera is a pretty significant, especially in performance or whatever it's called, is a pretty significant power consumer. You get dramatically lower battery life having the camera in performance. So this may actually be, a neutral. It may be a positive, or we may see some battery life loss for some better, lower, or smoother performance. This is, again, remains to be seen. It's one of the things that I definitely will want to be looking at when the firmware is released. Again, this is for the R5 and R6. They are adding full-time manual support, focus support for the 70 to 200 f4L, again, R5 and R6, and support for the RF 5.2 millimeter dual fisheye on the R5. So that isn't coming to the R6, just the R5. And then they've got 3 specific updates for the 1DX Mark III, which are adding the ability to use rate and voice memo simultaneously on the back of the camera. Well, not simultaneously in functions, but having them assigned to 2 buttons or simultaneously available on buttons on the back of the camera. Changing the default power saving for FTP settings to not use, which I'm not familiar enough with the 1DX and FTP to really have a opinion on that. And enhancing head detection for winter sports, so dealing with goggles and helmets. Presumably, I'm guessing that that's a enhancement to the viewfinder, so the standard phase AF and metering system as opposed to live view. Otherwise, I can't see why you wouldn't have also put that enhancement in the EOS R3 and then the R5 and R6, because AF enhancements to the software, the mirrorless side of things, the live view, whatever you want to call it, really should be portable across all platforms. So the new firmware Canon is saying will be available, Canon Europe at least is saying available December 2nd. So we're like 2 weeks away. So early Christmas present or something to that effect. But, looks pretty, at least we're not going to be, we shouldn't be waiting like 6 months or something for this. This should be right down the road. So the third thing on my list is Canon has also updated their list of supply shortage what do I want to say? The list of products affected by supply shortages. And the list is now down to the EOS R3, the RF14 to 35 F4L, the RF16 F2.8 STM, the RF100 to 400 5.6 to F8, USM, the 400 F28L, and the iCup ERHE, and the lens hood EW65C, which the iCup and the lens hood those are interesting. Can't really fathom why iCups and lens hoods would be supply constrained to the point that they actually would be on a supply shortage list or in such high demand. Anyway, the good news, at least for if you're like me, the 100 to 500 is now off the supply shortage list, which means that, well, hopefully I will get one soon because I finally broke down and ordered one. The lenses basically, the 100 to 500 has been frustrating to me because it's basically been unavailable since it was announced alongside the EOS R5 over a year ago. And I guess I could have jumped on. I probably would have one already if I'd have jumped on and pre-ordered it when it was announced or pre-ordered it shortly thereafter. I didn't because I was on the fence about it with the teleconverter situation and whatnot. So I had to really think that one over and how I wanted to approach that lens and, where things were going, et cetera, et cetera. Finally broke down and ordered one, so no idea when it's going to be here. It's going to be a race, maybe. Maybe that's how I should just sort of phrase this. It's going to be a race between my 100 to 500, which will get here when it gets here. Hopefully it gets here before I go to Yellowstone in the spring of next year. That would be preferable. It'd be nice to have a decent 500 to take out there and not have to carry around or rent or carry around something absolutely ridiculous and massive like a 600 F4 again, or a MacBook Pro M1, which I have broke down and ordered. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there that are fanboys about computers, and the reality is I hate all of them. So every OS sucks as far as I'm concerned. That I run Windows on my desktop, Mac OS on my laptop, and Linux on my servers. I'm fairly comfortable. I won't say necessarily fluent. Mac OS is probably the weakest of the three as far as my ability to function, tweak, power user, whatever you want to call it, through the operating system. But I like having all of them, and I like having all of them available because there's things that I can do in Linux that are hard to do in Windows or Mac OS. Well, Mac OS maybe not so much, but I'm also not going to run a custom server. Obviously, you can't really install Mac OS on a custom server, so building a server around Mac OS doesn't make an awful lot of sense to me. So having a file server running ZFS and so forth, it kind of comes down to running Linux or FreeNAS or TrueNAS or something like that, but I chose Linux. Windows is Windows. Windows I have probably the most familiarity with, but again, it's Windows. People always kind of go both directions on that. Some people love it, some people hate it. I have friends who have switched to Mac OS from Windows. I'm not one of them. There's things that I can do in Windows far better than easier than I can do in Mac OS, and there's things that I can do in Mac OS far easier than I can do in Windows. And quite honestly, I like having both options. I like being able to just switch my monitor over and do what I need to do on my Mac, and then switch my monitor over and do what I need to do on Windows. Okay. So, let's talk a little bit about the MacBook Pro M1s, because from the perspective of somebody who just bought one, I got criticized on my Nikon Z9 videos because I was talking out my rear end and why not wait until da 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 da. Well, because the reality was I was thinking about buying one. I was thinking about switching, and I wanted to talk about what I was seeing in the specs and why I thought it was interesting. Well, I've already bought a MacBook Pro. The reason I said earlier that this is a race between the MacBook Pro and my 100 to 500 is I have an estimated arrival time or shipping time of middle to end of January for the MacBook Pro. So it's a good thing I don't need it tomorrow. So it'll be a while before I actually have hands-on time with the computer. So we'll see what happens in the meantime, but I'm slightly excited. I am certainly interested in the possibility that I may end up switching all of my heavy-hitting video work over to the Mac, because right now the MacBook Pro should be more powerful in that respect than my Windows desktop is. And I'm not looking to upgrade my Windows desktop this year or next. So anyway, to put some perspective on this, I am replacing a mid-2014 MacBook Pro. It was the top spec 15-inch model, so it had a 2.8 gigahertz, 8-thread processor, 16 gig of RAMs and 16 gig of RAM and a 500 gig hard drive. For me, storage in a laptop or my desktop is not the primary place that I keep stuff. So putting 2, 4, 8, 10, whatever terabytes of storage in the computer doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. I'd much rather put the storage in my server where it's in ZFS, it's in RAID, it's backed up, it syncs automatically stuff up to Glacier on Amazon, so it's securely backed up off-site, etc., which is something I'm not doing on my Mac or my desktop directly. It's just too much of a pain in the rear. And of course, this was the NVIDIA GT 750M model, the old thing. So basically, I'm coming from anything I buy is going to be faster. I could buy my iPad Pro is probably faster than my laptop is. At the same time, I'm not upgrading because I need more performance. It's going to be nice to see more performance, certainly, but this is the problem that I've seen come up over and over again in the computer industry and in the smartphone, tablet industry, and in the camera industry. Sales slow down, and all of the pundits in the press jump out and start going on about how the market isn't doing this, or the market is buying, the market's no longer buying interchangeable lens cameras. Everybody is going to use their smartphones. The reality is that at some point you get hardware that's good enough. Cameras got there around 20 megapixels. Yeah, there is better. I mean, I'm not saying, but for a lot of people, you get to a point where it's good enough. Intel's desktop computers got there around 2010 or 12, maybe even a little earlier. So my laptop is 7 years old, and from I need to go edit some pictures in Lightroom perspective, it's fast enough. My desktop's 3 years old, and again, from I need to edit some pictures in Lightroom or do some video editing perspective, it's been fast enough. I have people who are still, that I'm friends with or help, that are still using now 10-year-old Core i5 2500s that, are still fast enough. And they're not really looking to upgrade their computer because why spend money to replace something that's perfectly good with something that and does what you need it to do with something new? You can spend the money on something else, like a new camera or a new lens or going somewhere to take pictures. So I'm not upgrading because I needed more power. I'm upgrading because my batteries are pretty much shot at this point. I've gone through 2 sets of batteries now in the MacBook Pro. I did a battery swap like 3 years ago or something like that. It was an iFixit kit. The batteries that iFixit has, in reading some reviews, maybe don't have the best reputation, but I said 3 years ago when I did this, because the laptop was already 5 years old, that I wasn't going to do that again, especially using the dental floss method of battery removal and almost severing my finger, or, well, not quite, but almost. I wasn't going to do that again. I didn't feel like taking the computer apart to replace the batteries just to keep prolonging a 7-year-old computer that, well, you know, I'd like an upgrade. I mean, I'd like something better with better battery life, a little bit more horsepower, the ability to go do something. So anyway, the problem, as I see it with the MacBook M1s, isn't so much the MacBook, well, the M1 Pro, M1 Max, isn't so much anything to do with performance or power or Mac OS or the system architecture or any of the stuff that everybody wants to argue about. The problem I see as somebody who's trying to spec out and configure the computer is that because it's not an Intel or AMD processor, there isn't very good information about how it compares. Like, there's some crappy benchmarks, and then there's some sort of benchmarks from places that aren't really complete because they don't really have comparable Intel systems. They're kind of only looking at, well, like the Mac from 2020 versus this one, that kind of thing. And broadly, just on feel. Like, I have a feel for if I'm looking at an Intel or an AMD system, I can, because it's the same architecture as what I'm using, and it's the same broad architecture of discrete PC or discrete CPU, discrete GPU, etc. I have a feel for how everything is working or will relate. With the M1, I have no clue how the GPU compares to what NVIDIA's offering, and looking at benchmarks, things are all over the place. Like, synthetic productivity stuff is through the roof, and it's comparable to like a top-end NVIDIA card for like 100 watts less power consumption, which is impressive. But then you look at other things like gaming performance or practical application testing, and the performance is worse than a much lower end card that is still better than what's in my computer. But, performance, it's not like there's a clear, distinct, it ranks 6th overall in the world of every GPU that's out there, or 15th or 1st or whatever. So there isn't this, it's not easy to directly compare the M1 Max or the M1 Pros GPU with what I'm used to. And the top of that is that the entire architecture is different. So in a desktop or traditional laptop with a discrete GPU, you have system memory and you have video memory. And so, like, I have in my desktop 32 gigs of system memory and 6 gigs of video memory. And so I know that when I'm doing something in, say, Resolve or Photoshop or playing a game, and it's loading textures into video memory, that maybe it's using all 6 gigs of video memory, but that 6 gigs of video memory also isn't coming out of my system RAM. So this is, whereas on a Mac M1, the video RAM and the system RAM come from the same really fast pool of integrated memory, and it's really fast. This isn't a slight. This is, actually pretty good because it makes the system RAM stupid fast. Everything's coming from that single pool, and as a result, I don't know how to evaluate how much system RAM I need based on my workload and how much video RAM is going to be used in a workload, and so on and so forth. So, like I said, on my workstation or desktop, I have 32 gig of RAM, of system RAM, and 6 gig of video RAM, which gives me basically 38 gig of RAM total, even though I can't directly access the 6 gig of video RAM to use as system stuff. When I'm working in an application, that means that I can it can push things into video memory for the processing that needs to be done on the GPU. And that goes sort of above and beyond what it's using in system memory. Well, that's not the case. So in an M1, if you have a 32 gig chip and you need, or a 32 gig configuration, and you need, for whatever you're doing, 6 gig of that to be video memory for the whatever is being processed, then you lose that from your system RAM, and your 32 gig goes down to 26 gig, which, I mean, still is a pretty good amount of RAM, but it becomes, it's harder for even somebody like me who's very familiar with computer stuff and whatnot to be able to simply make a decision about or understand exactly how things are profiled or will shake out, which has led me to slightly overspec the computer. I think very much overspec the computer in some respects, but you know, if I can keep using it for the next 5 to 10 years, I don't know if it's going to be a problem. And if I start doing 4K and 8K and a lot more complicated video editing, I think the memory is going to be really helpful. So what I did, this is what I went with and why I went with it. And of course, I'm just throwing this out there for people who may be interested or not. So my primary use case for my laptop is travel. When I'm shooting in the field somewhere, I want a device that I can work on and edit pictures while I'm out in the field. And primarily this is because, especially now with cameras like the R5 and R6 and Z1 or Z9 that can shoot 20 and 30 frames a second, and the Alpha 1 that can shoot 20 and 30 frames a second raw, the burden of editing, in my experience, I've always felt that the burden of editing is pretty high regardless, especially if you shoot a lot of very similar images. So when you start shooting 30 frames a second, the burden of editing kind of goes through the roof. And what I've done as my strategy to deal with that is to start trying to edit things in the field. So when I'm not shooting, when I'm done sitting in the room, hotel room, whatever, after dinner, I'll download my card, which gives me a backup copy, import it into Lightroom, and I'll start going through and looking at pictures, looking at good things, looking at bad things. It also gives me the ability, if I'm somewhere where, you know, for shooting a landscape, if I'm somewhere where I can go back and try something different, or I can go back and reshoot something that I horribly wrecked because I've done that and then been really annoyed the next, you know, basically the next day, or basically when I got home, that I can go back and do it. Now, when I'm at my desk, right now I use my Windows machine, but even if I start using the Mac more, it's hooked up to 27-inch monitors. I don't really care about portability or whatever for the laptop when it's at my desk. So with that in mind, I went with the 14-inch model because as much as I like a big screen and as much as I like my 15-inch MacBook Pro now, flying in non-first class, non-business economy coach, whatever you want to call it, even with a Coach Plus with the longer legroom, I have always had a problem comfortably fitting a 15-inch laptop on the tray table and not having it sort of wedged in a way where if somebody like really janked on their seat in front of me wouldn't kind of potentially mess up the computer. So 14-inch is smaller, it's lighter. The monitors, the screen size is only an inch smaller, but it's higher resolution, so I'm not actually losing working screen space or real estate. I just think that that's a better, with my use case of having a thing for travel, having a thing to be able to use in the field, I think that's a better option. And the fact that with the M1 MacBook Pros, you're not losing out on CPU or GPU performance or something like that because you bought the smaller model. It's not like it has been in the past where you could only get the fastest processor and the biggest chassis. I think that's a pretty good split, at least for that kind of use case. Now, CPU-wise, I went with the bottom tier Max, M1 Max. So it's the 10-core CPU, 24-core GPU, 16-core neural network processor M1 Max. I was seriously thinking about going with the M1 Pro because it's cheaper, and how many GPU cores do I really need? I mean, even the 16-core M1 Pro is going to be significantly faster than a 7-year-old GT 750M that I'm currently using. The Pro could also do 32 gig of RAM, which I considered a minimum if I'm going to view this as a possible semi-full-time or part-time workhorse for doing like video work or photo editing, because I shoot a lot of panos, and panos in Lightroom and Photoshop I can easily get to where it's using 16 to 18 gig of RAM, which is not 32, but again, we've got system memory being used for video memory, so that's like, again, the unknown there was something that I wasn't tremendously comfortable with. However, when I stopped and started really looking at it, I kind of came to the conclusion that the M1 Max felt safer. It's not necessarily any more performant CPU-wise. It's not running at higher clock speed as far as I know or anything like that. Yes, it's got 50% more GPU power, which is 50% more GPU power, so that's nothing to sneeze at. But what I think really sold me is the ability to drive 3 6K and 1 4K monitors versus just 2 6K monitors. Now, have 3 monitors or 4 monitors. Well, actually, a lot of times I have the little monitor on the camera hooked up to the computer, and that's a third monitor, which I wouldn't be able to do with the M1 Pro, even though I'm not using the M1 Pro for this, but or my laptop for this, but I would be able to do that with the M1 Pro, so that's kind of actually not a bad thought there. But I felt like that seemed safer to have more display output capabilities. The Max also doubles the number of video encode engines, so you have 2 instead of 1. I have no idea how this plays out in practice because I don't have one yet and I haven't been able to play with it. And, I haven't really seen any good benchmarks on it, but double the video encode engine seems like a good thing. And it doubles the number of hardware ProRes encoder and decoders. And I have no qualms with ProRes. I almost in some ways would prefer to deal with ProRes if I had the storage and so on and so forth, to be able to really deal with ProRes. It's kind of a real pain in Windows because, for example, DaVinci Resolve will play ProRes video, but it won't write ProRes video. So I can use ProRes as a source file from, say, an Atomos Ninja, or even just transcoding things on my server to ProRes, and I can bring them into DaVinci Resolve. I can do stuff, but because I'm on Windows, I can't write ProRes out from that and then use it somewhere else. That's one of those frustrating things where I kind of wish Apple would, if they, the format's not bad. I don't dislike ProRes, but I kind of wish they would get people to use it so there's less of a having to fight with things on a cross-platform workflow. So, like I said, that just feels like it's the right balance to me. At least for me. Now, if you were a super heavy scientific compute user, or you were like editing 8K video, which I'm still not even sure where I stand on 8K video. I don't care that much about it, but I mean, at some point, maybe, I don't know. I don't have the storage to do anything really with it, but then, that kind of thing. So maybe if you were doing like scientific GPU computing, or you were doing some really hardcore video processing effects stuff or whatever, having the full 32-core GPU would be beneficial. It would make things go faster. For me, everything's going to be faster. Anything's going to be faster than what I'm currently using, and faster is far less of a concern at the sort of situation and workflow that I'm in, so I just didn't think it was worth the extra $200 there. Now, the really hard question for me was memory. I was going to go with 32 gig. 16 gig is what I've got on my current MacBook Pro. It's pushing it. I've run into issues where I start swapping. I start having problems while working on really big panos because they take up a ton of RAM. I've seen guides all over the place. You need 32 gig for 4K video. You need 64 more gig for 8K video. You need this if you're working on these kinds of images, and so on and so forth. Maybe, I don't know. And this comes back to the point that I was making earlier about GPU and shared system and GPU RAM. And, you know, that may work great. 32 gig may work great for all of this stuff if you're working on a desktop with a discrete video card and its own dedicated memory. But how does it work when you're on a system with unified memory and high performance GPUs and so on and so forth and etc.? So after a lot of debate, I just said screw it and went with the 64 gig model. That will be the most RAM I've ever had in a computer. I've only got 32 gig in my workstation, 32 gig in my server, but it seems like, because you can't upgrade it, there's no upgrade process down the line, and I really am not anticipating replacing the computer in 2 or 3 years, that because again, it's performance, everything I've seen benchmark-wise puts the computer being comparable to similar top-ish end AMD or Intel laptops. And my laptop, it's certainly faster than my laptop from 7 years ago. So if a 7-year-old laptop does the job well enough performance-wise, then something that's substantially faster than that is going to do the job plenty good for the foreseeable future performance-wise. So now my criticism, I guess, ultimately here with memory is that Apple really doesn't give you a good handle on what you need. They don't really tell you how to size your memory configuration coming to the unified architecture, unified memory, etc., from a more traditional computer. And as a result, I mean, you could argue that they do it so that you buy the 64 gig model, but as a result, it's hard, I find, to make a really informed decision there. And then finally, I went with 1 terabyte of storage. As I said earlier, storage in the machine is great, but I can use external drives if I need more storage, and storage at like long-term storage I want on my server where I have ZFS and file system monitoring, proper cloud backup, etc., and not just trying to maybe back up something around in circles or something like that. I don't see the need to put a ton of storage in the computer as it stands. Unfortunately, this again too is something you can't upgrade, but you know, right now I'm barely using 50 gig, I think it is, of the 400 or 500 gig in my laptop because I just don't have a ton of software installed. I don't use that much. The vast majority of my storage goes to images when it's in the field. So I have a 500 gig SSD sitting around that's handy for that. I have obviously the cards that I'm shooting on, and then obviously I'll have a terabyte of storage in the computer because that's the configuration I went with. So anyway, I'm excited about the M1 MacBook Pro. I think it looks really solid. I'd be really excited if Microsoft announced that they had a Windows 11 version for ARM that ran on it, because that would be really, like, then I could probably just get rid of my desktop and not care. But I'm not ditching Windows, and I think the computer is kind of overkill, but overkill today, not so great tomorrow. And what's cheaper, buying one $3,000+ computer for the next 7 to 10 years, which is what happened with the last one. And hopefully I'll be able to get the same out of this one, or buying a $2,000 computer every 2 to 3 years to sort of keep up with the running. I like the first option. Plus, I hate switching computers. It's a real pain in the butt to get everything moved and configured and figure out what you do need and you don't need, and not, I know you can transfer settings and apps and whatnot, but then like, clean out in some respects, it's probably a good idea to just do a clean install of everything so that you clean out like the really old Adobe CS6 crap that like is still sitting somewhere, because I had Lightroom 5 or 6 installed at one point, that kind of crap, instead of just having the current sort of whatever. So it'll give me a clean slate. Anyway, that was the vlog. I actually ended up rambling about a computer longer than I had intended to, but like I said, that's the vlog for this week. No vlog next week, and there'll only be one video. So if you've made it this far, thanks for watching. If you thought this was interesting or informative or shed some light on some stuff for you, please let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, maybe subscribe too if you're not already, because remember, you can't forget to unsubscribe later if you don't subscribe now. And finally, if you think this would be useful to somebody you know, please share it. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.